offshoots of the superstition. There's a large collection of terminology that grows out of the concept of authority. What all such terms have in common is that they imply a certain legitimacy to one group of people forcibly controlling another group. Here are a few examples. Government, as mentioned before, government is simply the term used for the organization or group of people imagined to possess a right to rule. Many other terms describing parts of government, such as president, congressman, judge, and legislature, reinforce the supposed legitimacy of the ruling class. Law. The terms law and legislation have very different connotations from the words threat and command. The difference, again, depends upon whether the ones issuing and imposing such laws are imagined to have the right to do so. If a street gang issues commands to everyone in its neighborhood, no one calls such commands laws. But if government issues commands through the legislative process, nearly everyone calls them laws. In truth, every authoritarian law is a command backed by the threat of retaliation against those who do not comply. Whether it is a law against committing murder or against building a deck without a building permit, it is neither a suggestion nor a request, but a command backed by the threat of violence, whether in the form of forced confiscation of property, i.e. fines, or the kidnapping of a human being, i.e. imprisonment. What might be called extortion, if done by the average citizen, is called taxation when done by the people who are imagined to have the right to rule. What would be normally seen as harassment, assault, kidnapping, and other offenses are seen as regulation and law enforcement when carried out by those claiming to represent authority. Of course, using the term law to describe the inherent properties of the universe, such as the laws of physics and mathematics, has nothing to do with the concept of authority. Furthermore, there is another concept called natural law, which is very different from statutory law, i.e. legislation. The concept of natural law is that there are standards of right and wrong intrinsic to humanity that do not depend on any human authority, and that in fact supersede all human authority. Though that concept was the topic of many discussions in the not-so-distant past, it is rare to hear Americans using the term law in such a context today, and that concept is not what is meant by law in this book. Crime. The flip side of the concept of law is the concept of crime, an act of disobeying the law. The phrase committing a crime obviously has a negative connotation. The notion that breaking the law is morally wrong implies that the command being disobeyed is inherently illegitimate, based solely upon who gave the command. If a street gang tells a store owner, "Give us half your profits or we hurt you," no one would consider the store owner a criminal if he resisted such extortion. But if the same command is made by those wearing the label of government, with the demand being called law and taxes, then that very same store owner would be viewed by almost everyone as a criminal if he refused to comply. The terms crime and criminal do not by themselves even hint at what law is being disobeyed. It is a crime to slowly drive through a red light at an empty intersection, and it is a crime to murder one's neighbor. 100 years ago, it was a crime to teach a slave to read. In 1945 Germany, it was a crime to hide Jews from the SS. In Pennsylvania, it was a crime to sleep in or on top of a refrigerator outside. Literally committing a crime means disobeying the commands of politicians, and a criminal is anyone who does so. Again, such terms have an obviously negative connotation. Most people do not want to be called a criminal, and they mean it as an insult if they call someone else a criminal. Again, This implies that the authority issuing and enforcing the laws has the right to do so. Lawmakers. There is a strange paradox involved in the concept of lawmakers, in that they are perceived to have the right to give commands, impose taxes, regulate behavior, and otherwise coercively control people, but only if they do so via the legislative process. The people in government legislatures are seen as having the right to rule, but only if they exert their supposed authority by way of certain accepted political rituals. When they do, the lawmakers are imagined to have the right to give commands and hire people to enforce them, in situations where normal individuals would have no such right. To put it another way, the general public honestly imagines that morality is different for lawmakers than it is for anyone else. Demanding money under the threat of violence is immoral theft when most people do it, but it's seen as taxation when politicians do it. Bossing people around and forcibly controlling their actions is seen as harassment, intimidation, and assault when most people do it, but it is seen as regulation and law enforcement when politicians do it. They are called lawmakers rather than threat makers because their commands, if done via certain legislative procedures, are seen as inherently legitimate. In other words, they are seen as authority, and obedience to their legislative commands is seen as a moral imperative. Law enforcement. One of the most common examples of authority, which many people see on a daily basis, are the people who wear the label of police or law enforcement. The behavior of law enforcers and the way they are regarded and treated by others shows quite plainly that they are viewed not simply as people, but as representatives of authority to which very different standards of morality are believed to apply. Suppose, for example, someone was driving down the street not knowing that one of his brake lights had burned out. If an average citizen forced the driver to stop and then demanded a large sum of money from him, the driver would be outraged. But it would be viewed as extortion, harassment, and possibly assault and kidnapping. But when one claiming to act on behalf of government does the exact same thing by flashing his lights and chasing the person down if he doesn't stop, and then issuing a ticket, such actions are viewed by most as being perfectly legitimate. In a very real sense, the people who wear badges and uniforms are not viewed as mere people by everyone else. They are viewed as the arm of an abstract thing called authority. As a result, the properness of police officer behavior and the righteousness of their actions are measured by a far different standard than is the behavior of everyone else. They are judged by how well they enforce the law rather than by whether their individual actions conform to the normal standards of right and wrong that apply to everyone else. The difference is voiced by the law enforcers themselves, who often defend their actions by saying such things like, I don't make the law, I just enforce it. Clearly, they expect to be judged only by how faithfully they carry out the will of the lawmakers, rather than by whether they behave like civilized, rational human beings. Countries and nations. The concept of law and crime are obvious offshoots of the concept of government and authority, but many other words in the English language are either changed by the belief in authority or exist entirely because of that belief. A country or nation, for example, is a purely political concept. The line around a country is by definition the line defining an area over which one particular authority claims the right to rule, which distinguishes that location from the areas over other authorities claim the right to rule. Geographical locations are, of course, very real, but the term country does not refer only to a place, it refers to a political jurisdiction. another term stemming from the belief in authority. When people speak of loving their country, they are rarely capable of even defining what that means. But ultimately, the one thing the word country can mean is not the place or the people or any abstract principle or concept, but merely the turf of a certain gang claiming the right to rule. In light of that fact, the concept of loving one's country is rather a strange idea. It expresses little more than a psychological attachment to the other subjects who are controlled by the same ruling class, which is not at all what most people envision when they feel national loyalty and patriotism. People may feel love for a certain culture or a certain location and the people who live there, or to some philosophical idea, and mistake that for love of country. But ultimately, a country is simply the area that a particular government claims the right to rule. That is what defines the borders, and it is those borders which define the country.